So I'd like to use this recording to reflect on the process of my final major project. I'd like to start at the beginning of term two, where the project really began for me, because I struggled with my dissertation throughout term one. So I used the ISTD brief of migration to try and kickstart some ideas and look into certain things. I started looking at movement because movement is the key thing which makes migration what it is. And I started using that as a theme as such to create images or visuals. When exploring all these ideas, I decided to try and create a visual narrative using photography to create a series of images which would start a discussion around certain topics. For example, I started to look into Brexit, migration, and coronavirus. But then, when in March the coronavirus and the lockdown kicked in the UK, I reflected upon everything I was doing and realised that it was too broad trying to tackle so many large topics all at once. So I decided to hone in on the idea of coronavirus. The period from March to April kind of showed the most up and down fluctuations in the project, because I kept struggling with creating visuals because I didn't know what the narrative was going to be. I struggled to know what the message was, especially when it came to using these visuals to try and describe coronavirus as a whole through some sort of discussion. And then later, towards the end of the project, I managed to combine all these elements which had been appearing throughout my project, such as movement and divide, with the influence of personal experiences which I had been going through. So I decided I wanted to create a narrative which would speak to the things that we can no longer do in society with one another. So, for example, going to the pub, going to the cinema. And then this is where I started to use objects to represent certain things which we can no longer do. So, for example, the passport would represent holidays or travel because of the restrictions placed on like air travel, for example. And then all these images as a whole would point to the smaller things which we kind of taken for granted, and which we miss the most because we can no longer do or have them, yet they were so important to our everyday life, and yet we didn't realise it. To reflect on the project as a whole, I wish I found the narrative of what I wanted to say much sooner, because if I was able to do that, I would have been able to build a more critical analysis and deconstruction of the message I was forming through these images. And I would have been able to try more elements. For example, I wanted to try and bring in some human aspect of it. And by that, I mean the lack of human interaction which we now have because of the coronavirus. So I would have liked to try and create this translation of now and then. I still feel like I was able to achieve that using these objects as a bridge as such to connect the viewer to certain things which we can no longer have. But I do recognise that there could have been a lot more done to explore this idea and avenue if I had more time and managed to just organise everything a bit more orderly.